Dakota Territory, 1886. While his neighbors raced to throw up quick cabins with standard shingle roofs before winter, Norwegian immigrant Lars Halvorsen was still working in late September. 6 layers of birch bark, 6 inches of prairie sod laid grass down, then grass up, rafters spaced closer and built thicker to carry the weight. His neighbor Elias Turner called it wasteful. They called him a fool, building a potato patch on his rafters, a mud roof that would cave in the first heavy snow. Then January arrived with the blizzard that would become known as the Big Die-Up Winter, 40 below zero. Wind that buried fences and froze chimneys solid. In standard cabins, water turned to ice in wash basins overnight. Children woke to frost on their quilts and snow sifting through nail holes. But in Lars's loft under that mud roof, 25 degrees warmer than outside even after the fire died. Families abandoned their freezing cabins and fought through the storm to his door. The same neighbors who had mocked his Norwegian garden roof were now sleeping under it, alive only because one man understood something about heat, insulation, and survival that everyone else had dismissed as backward. What did he know about keeping heat from escaping through the roof that could mean the difference between life and death in a Dakota winter? If you value stories of practical wisdom that stood the test of time, make sure to subscribe. We've got more documented accounts worth remembering. The spring of 1886 brought an unusual bustle to the rolling prairie along Willow Creek in what would soon become North Dakota. Word had spread through the territorial land offices that prime homestead claims remained available in the coulee country, where good water ran year-round and shelter from the worst prairie winds could be found among the scattered groves of cottonwood and ash. By late April, survey stakes dotted the benchland above the creek, and the sound of axes rang across meadows that had known only the seasonal camps of the Lakota and the occasional fur trapper. The land agent, a precise man named Morrison who kept his records in a leather portfolio, recited the Homestead Act requirements to each new arrival with the mechanical rhythm of a practiced auctioneer. A house of at least 8 by 10 feet, 14 acres broken and under cultivation within 2 years. 5 years of continuous residence to prove up the claim. Simple enough terms that had drawn thousands west since the war ended, though Morrison had learned not to mention how many abandoned their claims before that 5th year arrived. Lars Halvorsen listened to these requirements on a warm May morning, his calloused hands turning his wool cap, while Morrison sketched the boundaries of the quarter section that would become his family's future. Unlike most of the claimants, Lars asked few questions about soil quality or creek access. His concerns centered on timber availability and the prevailing wind patterns during winter months. Morrison noted the man's accent, clearly Scandinavian, and the way his eyes lingered on the scattered stands of birch along the creek bottom, as if calculating something the land agent couldn't fathom. Within days of filing his claim, Lars had marked the cabin site on a slight rise that offered protection from the northwest wind, while maintaining access to both water and timber. His neighbors, settling their own claims along the creek, watched with growing bewilderment as the Norwegians' approach to construction diverged sharply from accepted frontier practice. Where they hurried to erect simple log walls topped with quickly laid shingle roofs, Lars spent weeks in the timber, selecting trees with the scrutiny of a craftsman choosing fine lumber. Elias Turner, whose adjacent claim lay just downstream, made no secret of his opinions about the Norwegians' methods. A veteran of Sherman's March and a man who prided himself on practical efficiency, Turner had thrown up a tight 12 by 16 cabin in less than 3 weeks. Solid cottonwood logs chinked with prairie clay, topped with a sensible peaked roof of sawn boards and cedar shingles purchased from the new mill in Jamestown. It was a structure that would have earned approving nods from any Army engineer, built to standard dimensions with materials that reflected the advancing civilization of the territory. Lars, meanwhile, continued his methodical selection of roof timbers, rejecting perfectly serviceable logs that Turner would have gladly used. The Norwegian sought out the straightest spruce and poplar, trees with minimal taper and few knots, hewn to dimensions that seemed extravagant to his watching neighbors. His rafters measured a full 2 inches thicker than standard practice demanded, spaced on 16-inch centers rather than the more economical 24 inches that sufficed for ordinary shingle loads. The peculiarity of Lars's approach became more pronounced as summer advanced. While other settlers laid their roof boards with the speed that frontier economics demanded, rough-sawn planks with gaps that would be covered by shingles and tar paper, Lars fitted his boards with the precision of a ship's carpenter. Each plank lay tight against its neighbor, edges planed smooth, the entire deck presenting a surface that could have shed water even without covering. But it was Lars's preparation for what he called the bark harvest that truly puzzled his neighbors. In late June, when the sap ran high in the scattered birch groves, Lars and his young helper, Olaus Björnsson, began stripping bark from selected trees with techniques that seemed as ancient as the forest itself. Using curved knives and wooden wedges, they peeled the outer bark in sheets that measured 4 feet wide and 8 feet long when properly removed. These sheets, carefully stacked under flat stones to prevent curling, accumulated beside the cabin site in numbers that defied explanation. Turner, observing this process during one of his frequent visits to offer unsolicited advice, calculated that Lars had harvested enough birch bark to waterproof 3 ordinary roofs. "You planning to roof the whole settlement, Halvorsen?" he asked with the hearty laugh of a man confident in his own practical wisdom. "That's enough bark to keep the rain off half the county." Lars continued his careful stacking without looking up. "In Norway, we use 6 layers, he said simply. "Maybe 7 if the bark is thin. Better too many than wake up in a puddle come spring." The explanation satisfied no one except Olaus, whose weathered face bore the marks of decades spent maintaining such roofs in the mountain valleys of his homeland. The old Norwegian nodded approvingly as Lars described his plans. 6 full layers of bark applied like overlapping shingles, each course extending from eave to ridge, the bark laid with its inner surface facing upward to shed water more effectively. As August heat shimmered across the prairie, Lars began the roof assembly that would define his reputation in the settlement. The birch bark went down first, each layer overlapping the one below by a full 6 inches, the edges sealed with pine pitch where necessary. The result, when viewed from the cabin's interior, resembled a vast sheet of leather stretched tight across the rafters, waterproof, flexible, and completely impervious to the wind that already whistled through the gaps in neighboring structures. But Lars was far from finished. While his neighbors applied their final coats of roof paint and declared their cabins ready for winter, the Norwegian began the process that would earn him lasting ridicule. Using a breaking plow borrowed from a more established homesteader, he cut prairie sod into uniform squares measuring 12 inches on each side and roughly 3 inches thick. The sod came from areas where buffalo grass and western wheatgrass had developed the deep, interwoven root systems that held the prairie together against wind and drought. The first layer of sod went down grass side down, roots forming a drainage mat that protected the birch bark from direct contact with soil. Each square fitted tightly against its neighbors, creating an unbroken surface that covered the entire roof. Then came the second layer, placed grass side up so that the living prairie could continue growing above the cabin. When complete, the sod measured nearly 6 inches thick, a living roof that transformed Lars's cabin into what appeared to be a grass-covered hill with windows and a door. The reaction from his neighbors ranged from bemused tolerance to open mockery. Turner, whose own roof gleamed with fresh cedar shingles, took to bringing visitors to observe what he called Halverson's potato patch, the settlement's self-appointed expert on construction matters. A carpenter named Williams, who had worked on railroad buildings, pronounced the entire structure a disaster waiting to happen. All that mud and grass, he declared with the authority of professional experience, will cave in that roof come the first heavy snow. Mark my words. Even the women gathering at Turner's cabin for one of the settlement's informal social evenings shook their heads over what they perceived as the Norwegians' stubborn refusal to adopt proper American methods. "It looks like a haystack with a chimney," observed Mrs. Henderson, whose own cabin boasted glass windows shipped from Minneapolis. "Poor Mrs. Halverson, having to live under all that dirt." But when September's heat gave way to the first cool nights of autumn, visitors to the Halverson cabin began to notice something that tempered their criticism. While other houses grew stuffy in the afternoon sun and required open windows to remain habitable, Lars's cabin maintained an even, comfortable temperature throughout the day. The thick-sawed roof absorbed the heat without transmitting it to the interior, creating a natural cooling system that made the small space remarkably pleasant even during the season's last hot spells. Kari Halverson, hanging wash on the line beside her earth-covered home, fielded questions from curious neighbor women with the quiet confidence of someone whose comfort spoke for itself. "It stays cool when it's hot," she explained simply, "and Lars says it will stay warm when it's cold. The old country way works, even if it looks different here." As October brought the first hard frosts and the cottonwood leaves turned gold along Willow Creek, the settlement prepared for its first winter with the mixed anticipation and anxiety that marked every frontier community. Most had heard stories of Dakota winters, but few had experienced the reality of 5 months when the thermometer might not rise above zero for weeks at a time. Turner and his neighbors checked their stores of firewood, examined their chimneys for draft problems, and pronounced themselves ready for whatever the climate might deliver. Lars Halverson made no such pronouncements. He simply continued splitting wood with the methodical persistence that had marked all his preparations, stacking cord after cord of split oak and ash in the lee of his grass-covered cabin. When curious neighbors asked why he needed so much fuel for such a small house, he replied with the laconic honesty that had become his trademark. "We'll see come January. Better to split wood in October than freeze in February." The first snow arrived on November 23, 1886, falling with the quiet persistence that marked the beginning of what old-timers would later remember as one of the territory's most brutal winters. What began as scattered flakes at dawn had become a steady curtain of white by afternoon, accumulating faster than anyone in the Willow Creek settlement had anticipated. By evening, 6 inches covered the prairie, and the wind that had been merely brisk at sunset now drove the snow horizontal across the benchland. Turner stood at his window, watching the storm with the satisfaction of a man whose preparations had been thorough and sensible. His cabin felt solid around him. The cottonwood logs chinked tight against drafts, the cedar shingle roof shedding snow and sleet with the efficiency that proper materials provided. The iron stove in the center of the room threw steady heat, and though the loft remained noticeably cooler than the main floor, it seemed warm enough for comfortable sleeping under heavy quilts. Across the creek bottom, barely visible through the driving snow, the Halverson place looked like nothing more than a snow-covered hill with a thin column of smoke rising from its chimney. Turner shook his head at the sight, wondering how anyone could feel secure under all that dirt and grass when a proper roof of honest lumber and shingles provided such obvious protection. The Norwegian's methods might work in whatever backwoods valley he'd come from, but Dakota Territory demanded American solutions. The storm continued through the night, and by morning the settlement woke to a transformed landscape. Drifts had piled against the north sides of buildings. Fence posts disappeared under smooth curves of white, and the creek ran dark between banks that seemed to rise higher with each passing hour. Williams, the carpenter whose railroad experience gave weight to his opinions on construction matters, made his rounds through the settlement to check on his neighbors and assess how various building methods were handling their first real test. At the Henderson place, he found minor problems that could be expected in any new construction. A few shingles had lifted slightly in the wind, allowing snow to work underneath and form small drifts in the loft corners. Nothing serious, Williams assured Mrs. Henderson, just the sort of settling that occurred in any frame building during its first winter. A few nails and some additional tar paper would solve the problem come spring. Turner's cabin showed similar minor issues. The temperature difference between the main room and the loft had become more pronounced overnight, with frost forming on the underside of the roof boards, where warm air from below met the cold surface above. Williams explained this as normal condensation, the result of heated air carrying moisture that would freeze when it contacted cold surfaces. "Every cabin does it," he said with the authority of professional experience. "You just need to keep the fire going steady and maybe hang a blanket across the loft opening to trap more heat upstairs." But it was at the German settler's place, a cabin built with commendable speed from green cottonwood logs, that Williams encountered the first serious problem. The rapid construction and unseasoned timber had created gaps between logs as the wood dried and shrank. Snow had worked through these openings during the night, creating small drifts across the floor that hadn't melted despite the warmth from a well-tended stove. The German family had spent the night pushing snow back outside and stuffing rags into the worst gaps, a temporary solution that would need constant attention until proper chinking could be applied. Williams found himself reluctantly curious about conditions at the Halverson place, though he approached the grass-covered cabin with the skepticism of a man whose professional judgment had been publicly questioned. What he discovered challenged his assumptions about proper construction methods in ways he wasn't prepared to acknowledge. The interior temperature felt remarkably even from floor to loft, without the pronounced stratification that marked every other cabin in the settlement. More puzzling still, no frost had formed on any interior surface, despite the night's bitter cold and the obvious presence of heated air throughout the structure. Lars, noting Williams's careful examination of the loft area, offered a simple explanation that carried the weight of generations of cold weather building experience. "Heat goes up," he said, gesturing toward the thick sod roof above their heads. "If your roof is just boards and paper, you're heating the sky. This," he patted one of the massive roof timbers, "keeps the warmth where people need it." The practical demonstration troubled Williams more than he cared to admit. His understanding of proper construction had been built on standard American practices that emphasize speed, economy, and the use of manufactured materials. The idea that a roof made of dirt and grass could outperform cedar shingles and tar paper contradicted everything he thought he knew about building science. Yet the evidence surrounded him in the form of consistently warm air and dry surfaces throughout the Norwegian small cabin. Kari Halverson, tending her cook stove with the easy efficiency of a woman comfortable in her surroundings, offered coffee to the visiting carpenter and made casual observations that further undermined his confidence. The bread she'd baked the previous evening had remained soft overnight, she mentioned, unlike the loaves in neighboring cabins that often hardened when rooms grew too cold during the night. Water in her wash basin had stayed liquid, requiring no morning ritual of breaking ice before washing could begin. These details, seemingly minor, represented fundamental differences in how the two construction methods managed the interior environment. Williams understood that heat loss through roofs could be significant, but he'd never seen such a clear demonstration of the principle in action. The Halverson cabin seemed to breathe differently than conventional structures, maintaining stable conditions with less fuel consumption and more even temperature distribution. As December advanced and more storms swept across the territory, the performance differences between building methods became increasingly apparent to the entire settlement. Turner found himself burning more wood than anticipated, not because his stove was inefficient, but because heat seemed to escape through the roof faster than he could generate it. On the coldest nights, when outside temperatures dropped below zero, his loft became barely habitable despite a fire that burned continuously in the main room. The German settlers' problems grew more serious as gaps between his logs widened with continued drying. Snow infiltration became a nightly problem, and the constant battle to maintain interior warmth left the family exhausted and their fuel supplies dwindling faster than planned. Williams, called upon to suggest solutions, recommended additional chinking and the installation of a ceiling to trap more heat in the living areas, modifications that would require both materials and labor that were difficult to obtain during winter months. Other settlers reported similar challenges as the season progressed. Condensation problems led to moisture accumulation in lofts, creating conditions that threatened both comfort and the structural integrity of wooden components. Ice dams formed along roof edges, where warm air leaked through inadequate sealing, creating potential water damage when spring thaws eventually arrived. The Henderson place developed a persistent cold draft that no amount of additional chinking seemed to eliminate, making one corner of their main room nearly unusable during the worst weather. Throughout these mounting difficulties, the Halverson cabin continued to perform with the steady reliability that marked well-designed cold climate construction. Visitors continued to remark on the even temperatures and absence of drafts, though many remained reluctant to admit that the despised mud roof might actually represent superior building science. The thick sod layer, acting as both insulation and thermal mass, absorbed heat during the day and released it slowly throughout the night, moderating temperature swings and reducing fuel consumption in ways that conventional roofing materials simply couldn't match. By mid-December, as the territory settled into the extended cold that would characterize the winter of 1886 and 1887, even the most skeptical settlers began to acknowledge privately that the Norwegians' methods deserved more serious consideration. The grass-covered cabin that had looked so primitive during construction now appeared remarkably sophisticated in its response to winter conditions, maintaining habitability with less effort and fuel than structures built according to accepted frontier standards. But the real test lay ahead, in the months when Dakota Territory's climate would reveal its full severity and determine which building methods could sustain human life through conditions that would challenge every assumption about adequate shelter and proper construction practices. January brought conditions that transformed the Willow Creek settlement from a collection of hopeful homesteads into a collection of barely survivable shelters scattered across a landscape that seemed intent on erasing all trace of human habitation. The thermometer that Turner had mounted outside his cabin window registered 28 degrees below zero on the morning of January 15th, and the mercury would not rise above zero for the next 3 weeks. Wind that had been merely bitter in December now carried the crystalline edge of air so cold it seemed to cut through wool and leather as if they were summer cotton. The blizzard that began on the 20th buried fence lines completely and piled drifts against cabin walls until some structures appeared to be emerging from white hillsides rather than standing on level ground. Snow driven by 40-mile-per-hour winds found every gap in construction, every imperfect joint, every place where builders had trusted speed over precision. What had seemed like minor construction flaws in November became life-threatening deficiencies as the full severity of a Dakota Territory winter revealed itself. Turner woke on the morning of January 22nd to find his wash basin frozen solid despite a fire that had burned continuously through the night. The iron stove, glowing red with the heat of oak logs fed every 2 hours, seemed to warm only a small circle around itself, while the rest of the cabin remained barely above freezing. Frost covered the interior walls wherever moisture from cooking and breathing had condensed and frozen, creating a glittering coating that never melted even with the stove running at full capacity. The loft, which had seemed merely cool in December, now registered temperatures that made sleep nearly impossible even under multiple layers of quilts and buffalo robes. Turner's alcohol thermometer, hung from a roof beam to monitor conditions, showed readings that rarely rose above 10 degrees above zero even at midday when the main room felt tolerable. Ice formed on the underside of the roof boards where warm air met cold surfaces, creating a persistent dripping that soaked bedding and made the upper story essentially uninhabitable. Across the settlement, similar conditions threatened the survival of families who had believed their preparations adequate for any weather the territory might deliver. The German settler found his cabin increasingly difficult to heat as gaps between logs allowed cold air to enter as fast as warm air could be generated. His children had moved their sleeping arrangements to the main floor, crowded around the stove with parents who took turns feeding wood to fires that consumed their winter fuel supplies at an alarming rate. Mrs. Henderson discovered that bread left on her table overnight became hard enough to require soaking in hot coffee before it could be chewed. Ink in her pen froze solid, making letter writing impossible except when accomplished immediately next to the stove. The family's milk cow, housed in a hastily constructed lean-to attached to the cabin's south wall, required constant attention to prevent water from freezing in her drinking trough and feed from becoming too cold to digest properly. Williams, whose professional confidence had been shaken by his December observations at the Halvorsen place, found himself struggling with problems that challenged his understanding of basic construction principles. His own cabin, built according to railroad standards that had served well in more temperate climates, leaked heat through the roof at a rate that made adequate warming nearly impossible. Ice dams formed along the eaves where escaping warm air melted accumulated snow, creating conditions that threatened structural damage when eventual thaws arrived. The carpenter's evening rounds through the settlement became increasingly grim as he encountered families huddled around stoves that consumed wood faster than the settlers could split and haul it. Children wore coats and mittens indoors, their breath visible in rooms where fires burned continuously. Women cooked wearing heavy shawls, and men slept in the same clothes they wore for outdoor chores, adding blankets and robes that still left them shivering through the night. But it was at the Olsen place, a cabin thrown up hastily in late September, that Williams encountered the most serious crisis. The family had awakened to find snow covering their floor, driven through gaps in the walls by wind that found every imperfection in construction. Their chimney, inadequately protected from downdrafts, had filled the interior with smoke when they attempted to build up the fire, forcing them to choose between suffocation and cold that threatened life itself. Throughout these mounting crises, the Halvorsen cabin continued to function with a stability that defied explanation, according to conventional building wisdom. Lars had begun keeping careful records of interior temperatures, using an alcohol thermometer positioned in the loft to document conditions that contradicted everything the settlement thought it knew about cold weather construction. On nights when outdoor temperatures dropped to 40 below zero, his loft maintained readings between 15 and 20 degrees above zero, warm enough for comfortable sleep under ordinary bedding. The thick sod roof, which neighbors had dismissed as primitive and structurally unsound, proved to function as a sophisticated thermal management system. The 6 inches of prairie sod, with its interwoven root structure and high organic content, absorbed heat from the cabin's interior during hours when the stove burned hottest, and released that stored warmth gradually throughout the night. This thermal mass effect, combined with the insulating properties of the organic material, created conditions that remained stable even when the fire burned low or died completely. More remarkably, the multiple layers of birch bark beneath the sod continued to provide perfect waterproofing while allowing the roof system to breathe in ways that prevented the condensation problems plaguing every other structure in the settlement. No frost formed on interior surfaces, no ice accumulated on roof timbers, and no moisture problems threatened either comfort or structural integrity. The cabin seemed to manage humidity and temperature with the sophisticated precision of a system designed by engineers rather than built from traditional knowledge. Kari Halvorsen, maintaining her household routines with an ease that seemed almost supernatural to visiting neighbors, offered practical demonstrations of her cabin's superior performance. Bread remained soft overnight, requiring no special storage or reheating before consumption. Water in wash basins stayed liquid without constant fire tending, allowing normal washing and cooking routines to continue even during the coldest periods. Clothes dried properly when hung on interior lines, unlike the frost-covered garments that stiffened like boards in other cabins. These performance differences, initially dismissed as minor curiosities, now represented the margin between tolerable hardship and life-threatening conditions. As January temperatures continued their relentless assault on human comfort and safety, the settlement began to understand that the Norwegians' backward methods might actually represent building science far more sophisticated than anything they had brought from eastern states or learned from frontier construction manuals. The Halvorsen loft, warmed by heat that rose through the cabin and was trapped by the massive thermal mass of the sod roof, remained the only upper-story space in the settlement where children could sleep safely through the night. The technique that had earned ridicule during construction now provided the only consistently habitable interior environment within 20 miles of Willow Creek, a fact that would soon force every settler to confront their assumptions about proper building methods and the wisdom of traditional knowledge. The blizzard that struck on February 3, 1887, arrived with a violence that dwarfed every previous storm the Willow Creek settlement had endured. Wind that began as a steady 40-mile-per-hour gale escalated throughout the night into gusts that shook the sturdiest cabins and drove snow with the force of buckshot against any surface that offered resistance. By dawn, drifts had buried entire buildings to their roof lines, and the familiar landmarks that had oriented the scattered homesteads had disappeared beneath a white wilderness that seemed to stretch unbroken to every horizon. Turner, awakening to the sound of his cabin walls groaning under wind pressure, found his interior transformed into something barely recognizable as human shelter. Snow had forced its way through every imperfection in construction, creating drifts across his floor that reached nearly to his knees in places. The temperature difference between his main room and the murderous cold outside had shrunk to perhaps 10 degrees, despite a fire that had consumed his carefully rationed wood supply at twice the normal rate throughout the night. Worse still, his chimney had begun to malfunction as ice accumulated in the flue, restricting the draft that carried smoke away from the interior. Each attempt to build up the fire filled the cabin with choking smoke that forced him to choose between warmth and breathable air. The stove that had been his lifeline through weeks of bitter cold now threatened to kill him through suffocation, a cruel irony that left him crouched near the floor, where the air remained marginally clear. The situation at neighboring homesteads had deteriorated beyond the merely uncomfortable into conditions that threatened immediate survival. Mrs. Henderson, alone with 2 young children while her husband attempted to reach their livestock shelter, found herself unable to maintain adequate heat in any part of her cabin. The children, wrapped in every available blanket and quilt, showed the blue-tinged fingertips that marked the early stages of frostbite, despite being indoors near a fire that consumed wood as fast as she could feed it. Williams, whose professional pride had sustained him through weeks of mounting evidence that his construction methods were inadequate, now faced the collapse of everything he thought he understood about building science. His own cabin, erected according to the railroad standards that had served adequately in Illinois, leaked heat through the roof so rapidly that he could feel cold air sinking from the ceiling, even while standing directly beside his glowing stove. Ice had formed on interior walls wherever his breath had condensed during the night, creating surfaces so cold that touching them with bare skin could cause instant injury. The German settler's family had abandoned any pretense that their cabin could provide adequate shelter. Gaps between logs that had seemed manageable in December now admitted snow and wind that made the interior nearly as cold as the outdoors. The children had developed the persistent cough that marked the beginning of pneumonia, while their parents took turns staying awake to maintain a fire that seemed to provide heat only within arm's length of the stove itself. At the Olson place, the crisis had reached its inevitable conclusion. The family's inadequate chimney had filled their cabin with smoke so dense that breathing became impossible, while their improvised construction methods had failed completely under the assault of wind and cold. They had spent the night wrapped in buffalo robes in a corner where the walls met, sharing body heat and waiting for either rescue or death, while their fire died to coals they dared not feed. It was Turner who made the first desperate journey through the howling darkness, abandoning his own failing shelter to seek refuge at the only place in the settlement, where warmth and safety still existed. Fighting through drifts that reached his chest and wind that threatened to knock him down with every step, he stumbled across the 100 yards that separated his claim from the Halverson place, following the barely visible glow from a chimney that continued to draw properly when every other flue in the settlement had failed. The door that opened to his frantic knocking revealed an interior that seemed to belong to a different world entirely. Warm air, free of smoke and dense enough to breathe deeply, surrounded him as he collapsed just inside the threshold. The cabin's atmosphere felt not merely survivable, but comfortable, with temperatures that allowed normal movement and conversation without the desperate huddling around heat sources that had become the universal posture of winter survival. Lars helped his neighbor to a chair near the stove and offered coffee that had remained liquid throughout a night when water had frozen solid in every other cabin within 20 miles. The Norwegian's calm demeanor suggested that the storm raging outside represented manageable hardship rather than mortal threat, an attitude that seemed impossible given the conditions Turner had just escaped. Within hours, other desperate families began arriving at the grass-covered cabin, each carrying the essential supplies and bedding needed for indefinite shelter. Williams appeared first, supporting Mrs. Henderson and her children through drifts that had grown too deep for the youngsters to navigate alone. The German family followed, the father carrying his youngest child, while the mother led their cow through snow that reached the animal's belly. The Olson family arrived last, smoke-blackened and half-frozen, having abandoned their cabin when smoke inhalation made remaining there impossible. By evening, 13 people and 2 milk cows had taken refuge in a space designed for a family of 3, creating conditions that would have been intolerable in any other structure, but which the sod-roofed cabin accommodated with remarkable grace. The loft, which in every other building had become uninhabitably cold, provided sleeping space that remained warm enough for children and elderly settlers to rest comfortably under ordinary bedding. The thermal mass of the thick sod roof continued to absorb and release heat with the steady rhythm that had sustained the cabin through months of brutal cold, now extending its protection to more than 4 times the intended occupancy. Kari Halverson, managing cooking and household arrangements for the expanded group, demonstrated the superior functionality of her interior environment through practical tasks that had become impossible elsewhere. Bread dough rose properly in the consistent temperatures her cabin maintained. Laundry could be washed and dried using methods that had failed completely in structures where interior surfaces remained below freezing. Water for cooking and washing stayed. Liquid without constant attention to fire management. The contrast between conditions inside and outside the sod-roofed cabin was so dramatic that it challenged fundamental assumptions about the relationship between construction methods and survival in extreme climates. Settlers who had mocked the mud roof as primitive and impractical now found themselves alive only because one man had understood principles of cold weather construction that transcended contemporary American building practices. As wind continued to howl around the grass-covered cabin and snow piled against walls that remained solid and draft-free, Turner found himself confronting the humbling reality that everything he had believed about proper construction had been wrong. The Norwegian garden roof that he had dismissed as wasteful foolishness now sheltered his life and the lives of his neighbors, providing warmth and safety when accepted frontier wisdom had failed completely. The spring thaw of 1887 revealed a landscape transformed not merely by months of brutal winter, but by the fundamental failure of conventional frontier building practices to sustain human life under conditions that the territory's climate delivered without warning or mercy. As snow melted from the Willow Creek bottomland, and the first meadowlarks returned to fence posts that had been buried for months, the scattered homesteads emerged like archaeological sites, their damaged structures telling the story of a winter that had tested every assumption about adequate shelter and proper construction methods. Turner's cabin, which had seemed so solid and sensible during its construction, now showed the accumulated damage of 5 months spent fighting a losing battle against heat loss and structural stress. Cedar shingles had cupped and split under repeated freeze-thaw cycles, creating gaps that had admitted snow and rain throughout the worst storms. The tar paper beneath, once proud evidence of modern building materials, hung in tatters where wind had found purchase at loose edges and torn away entire sections of what was supposed to be weatherproofing. More troubling still were the signs of structural damage that winter's assault had inflicted on buildings erected according to accepted frontier standards. Roof timbers had sagged under loads they were never designed to carry, creating permanent deformation that would require extensive repair before the structures could be considered safe for continued habitation. Ice dams had formed wherever heat leaking through inadequate insulation had melted accumulated snow, and the resulting water damage had stained interior walls and warped floorboards in patterns that told the story of thermal inefficiency written in rotting wood and peeling bark chinking. Williams, whose professional reputation had been built on railroad construction standards that emphasized speed and economy, found himself confronting evidence that challenged everything he thought he understood about building science in cold climates. His own cabin showed frost damage to interior surfaces, wherever moisture from cooking and breathing had condensed and frozen repeatedly throughout the winter. The constant battle to maintain adequate interior temperatures had consumed nearly twice the fuel he had calculated as necessary, leaving him with depleted wood supplies and a structure that would require significant modification before it could face another Dakota winter. The German settlers' problems had progressed beyond mere discomfort into structural failures that made his cabin essentially uninhabitable without major reconstruction. Gaps between logs had widened to the point where light was visible through the walls, even in daylight, and the hasty chinking applied during construction had fallen out in chunks, leaving openings that no amount of additional clay and moss could adequately seal. His family had survived the winter only through the refuge provided by the sod-roofed cabin, and their own structure now stood as a monument to the inadequacy of speed over soundness in frontier construction. Yet it was the condition of the Halverson cabin that provided the most compelling evidence of superior building science in action. As Lars carefully peeled back a small section of the living sod roof to inspect the birch bark waterproofing beneath, he revealed materials that had weathered 5 months of brutal conditions without showing any signs of deterioration or failure. The bark layers remained tough and flexible, their overlapping arrangements still perfectly sealed against moisture penetration. The sod itself had not only survived the winter, but had actually improved in structure, its root systems having grown more densely interwoven during the months when snow cover provided protection and consistent moisture. The thermal performance that had seemed almost magical during the worst storms now revealed itself as the predictable result of building science that had been refined through generations of cold climate construction experience. The massive thermal mass of the 6-inch sod layer had absorbed heat during periods of intense fire and released it gradually during the long hours when fuel conservation required reduced heating, creating temperature stability that conventional roofing materials simply could not match. Turner, swallowing pride that had sustained him through months of mounting evidence that his methods were inadequate, approached Lars with a request that would have seemed impossible the previous autumn. Could the Norwegian help him retrofit his cabin with at least some version of the sod roof system that had proved so effective? The conversation that followed marked the beginning of a quiet transformation in the settlement's approach to cold weather construction, a shift from blind adherence to accepted practices toward recognition that traditional knowledge might contain wisdom that transcended contemporary American building standards. The technical discussions that occupied the settlement through late spring revealed the specific principles that made the Norwegian system so effective. Lars explained, in terms his neighbors could understand, how heat naturally moved upward through any structure and how conventional roofs provided virtually no resistance to this loss. A typical shingle roof, he demonstrated using simple calculations, might have an insulating value roughly equivalent to a single layer of wool cloth, while his sod roof system provided thermal resistance comparable to a stone wall several feet thick. The birch bark component, initially dismissed as primitive waterproofing, proved to represent sophisticated understanding of moisture management in cold climates. The multiple layers, each overlapping the one below like shingles, but sealed with natural flexibility rather than rigid materials, created a membrane that breathed enough to prevent condensation buildup while remaining completely impervious to rain and melted snow. Modern tar paper, by contrast, either leaked when damaged or trapped moisture when intact, creating conditions that led to structural deterioration over time. Williams, whose professional integrity had been shaken by the winter's revelations, found himself studying the Norwegian construction methods with the intensity of an apprentice learning a new trade. The closer rafter spacing that had seemed wastefully expensive now revealed itself as necessary engineering for loads that conventional American practice simply ignored. The careful attention to timber selection and joint fitting that had appeared obsessively perfectionist proved to be essential elements of a system designed to last decades, rather than merely survive a single season. By midsummer, 3 of the settlement's cabins had been retrofitted with modified versions of the sod roof system, using techniques adapted from Lars's methods, but scaled to materials and labor available to families still recovering from winter losses. Turner's cabin received a simplified version that combined existing shingles with an overlay of birch bark and 4 inches of prairie sod, creating thermal performance that dramatically exceeded his previous roof, while requiring modification rather than complete reconstruction. The German family, working with neighbors who had learned the techniques during their desperate winter refuge, erected an entirely new cabin that incorporated sod roof methods from the foundation up. The structure that emerged looked more like a grass-covered hill than a conventional house, but its interior performance during the following winter would validate every principle that the Norwegian methods represented. Even Mrs. Henderson, initially the most skeptical about roof systems that looked primitive and required more labor than manufactured materials, found herself advocating for modifications that incorporated at least some thermal mass into her family's shelter. The difference between survival and comfort during extreme weather had proved too dramatic to ignore, and the settlement's collective experience had demonstrated that traditional knowledge might represent building science far more sophisticated than anything their previous experience had provided. The transformation of the Willow Creek settlement from a collection of conventional frontier cabins into a community that understood and applied cold climate construction principles marked more than mere adaptation to local conditions. It represented recognition that wisdom accumulated through generations of harsh weather survival might contain technical knowledge that transcended the limitations of contemporary American building practices.